All right. Hello. Thank you all for coming to Corcoran tonight. This is a lecture happening in conjunction with the exhibition on display in Gallery 31, A Quiet Disposition, which is an exhibition of 5 research-based projects around the themes of drones by James Bridle, who's with us tonight. I am Joseph Hale, the director of Put It Together. But with us tonight is James Bridle. He's sort of a man of many hats. He's an artist, writer, publisher, technologist, among many other things. His work primarily focuses on the relationship between humanities and technology. It's found online and offline. His artworks have been displayed internationally in the UK, Netherlands, France, China, and elsewhere. He's very prolific and writer, and especially known for coining the term the new aesthetic. And new aesthetic is a very sort of complicated idea that I'll let him focus on, but I have summarized it in some ways by saying it's a lot of it's related to the way machine-mediated reality that we live in today has affected the way sort of human interactions are, and especially the way that it appears visually. That's definitely the way it comes into the arts. He's also a really prolific writer in publications like Wired, Icon, Domus, Cabinet. He contributes a regular column for The Observer. He's a very prolific speaker. I could go on and on and on about all these, all his features. You can also find them on the wall in Gallery 31. So I'll let you read them there because it's a list. But I just want to speak really briefly about why we wanted to bring him here. And it really has to do with the fact that we noticed that this idea, this icon, medium of the drone was sort of like a collectively unconscious, very prolific thing. It had a lot of tension in it. And a lot of artists were using it in different ways as an icon, say in a painting, or as a vehicle, as the mode of their work. So maybe their work's about remote viewing or something like that. That said, there's a real sort of why is that tension there? And a lot of it has to do with, I think, that we're going through this question of what does it mean to have these vehicles acting remotely and to be so desensitized to what they are and what it means to be a part of, sort of complicitly a part of it as a nation. Given our location, we are very close to the White House. We are in this sort of seat of these kinds of conversations. We wanted to invite somebody who would instigate the conversation in the best possible way, and who is already working in this way through the new aesthetic and through these drone-related projects. And this actually originally came out of some conversations with some of the really creative guys we have in IT, namely Adrian Parsons and Joe Orzal, who we were originally trying to figure out like how we could make this show happen because it's in context of war photography in general. Ultimately, we decided a guy in this area who we thought would be the perfect guy. We contacted him. He said yes, and sort of the rest is history. So I just want to welcome James Bridle. He's right here, and let him take over the mic because I'm just bumbling right now.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. Thank you all very much for coming along this evening, and also a huge thank you to the Corcoran, not only for inviting me and bringing me here, but for all the work they've put in over the last few days, particularly installing the exhibition and kind of in the last month setting this all up. It's a privilege to be doing all of this. Yeah, drones, quiet disposition. I went to see this guy this morning in the Air and Space Museum, which was a deeply strange experience for me, because to have that experience was one of the starting points of this work. To stand in front of or underneath one of these very singular pieces of technology and to get some sense of it. And it was both deeply strange and, as often with these things, sort of strangely pathetic, that it was both kind of everything I thought it might be and nothing. It's just an object hanging in a museum. It's a very particular object. The one you have in DC here is a very particular airframe. It's the particular drone, the particular predator that first fired a Hellfire missile. It was the first of these to be armed, which is an incredibly significant step. The history of surveillance platforms in particular is essentially a history of weaponization as well. You see it across every aspect of this. Once you have this kind of eye, this privileged view, the next thing is to strap a weapon to it. Because the power relationships, the unequal power relationships that are kind of embedded in surveillance, the watcher and the watched, naturally lead on to kind of forms of violence. But you also, it's very rare for most of us and most people we know to be able to get this close to one of these things, to actually stand in front of it. And that's a big spur to a lot of this work. The way we usually see them is kind of key. Here's a way we usually see them. Here's a picture of a drone on the website of a British campaigning organization that campaigns against certain types of weapons. Here it is again on the front of Pakistan's leading English language newspaper. The same drone, you might notice. And this particular image I'd seen around a lot, and it sort of fascinated me. There was something odd about it. It was sort of endlessly repeated. I started seeing it everywhere. And I realized why this was. It's because it's the first Google image result for drone. If you search drone, there you go. And most people, journalists and civilians and bloggers and everyone else included, boom, there it is. And it's a compelling one. It's one of the very rare images of a drone firing the weapon. So that's kind of key to it as well. So it gets endlessly repeated across the web in all kinds of ways. And you see it in kind of image macros and all kinds of things as well. But I knew there was something funny about this, and I started staring at it longer and deeper. And after a while, when you do, and when it's blown up to this size, as you rarely see it, you might realize that it's not real. This is an entirely faked image. I tracked it back, managed to work out how it had come into being. And it was first posted to a 3D modeling hobbyist website in 2009. A guy who was training to be a 3D modeler using computer programs. He decided to test out his skills on making a drone. And so he made this image, and he rendered it out, and he put it into Photoshop, and he put some mountains from Afghanistan in the background, and he created this missile, and he used a kind of YouTube Photoshop tutorial to work out how to do like flames coming out the back of the missile and stuff. And once you start looking, there's problems. The tail number's wrong, and the alignment of the New York on the tail is wrong. Those are all the kind of details that should make us stop and figure, but we haven't. This image continues to repeat everywhere. The drones themselves, as I said, remain almost always out of sight and invisible, and it turns out that our most widely distributed image of the drone is itself a fiction, which for me speaks to our kind of lack of understanding of these technologies. I'll come back to that through other routes. Other routes like these other images that I collect. This is another widely circulated image of a drone strike, except of course it's not a drone strike. This is a drone that's owned by NASA, doing trials to see if drones can be used to put out forest fires. It's entirely civilian use of the weapon. This, on the other hand, is a very real image. This is an image of a global hawk, one of the largest of the unmanned vehicles, at an air show in France. And yet, to my eye, it looks almost entirely unreal. This strange, smooth object that looks like it's kind of been inserted into the frame from some other dimension. Or this one, which is a global hawk undergoing electromagnetic testing in a sealed, electromagnetically sealed environment. The drones cross over between these different kind of modes of being and represent different things to different people. This one's strange to me as it repeats the kind of imagery we've expected of combat aircraft throughout history. Pilots drawing their kills on the nose of the aircraft, and even, in fact, the names of the pilots. This is a British RAF drone stationed in Afghanistan. Those pilots at the time were probably in Nevada, but they still write their names on the front of the plane. or even anthropomorphize them. This is a French one. The French like to draw faces on the front of their drones, like airmen have done for 100 years at least now. There's an anthropomorphization going on here that we find kind of common in technologies. And that it's unclear to what extent they are anthropomorphizable, to what extent we can understand them through those kind of lenses. This is an image that I made, strangely. I had this idea of what it would be like if drones were making Google Maps, and perhaps if they might kind of capture themselves doing so. So I mocked this up in Photoshop, just a little opaque silhouette of the drone on a screen grab from Google Maps, posted it to Flickr, and of course, as the internet does, this image started to replicate itself across the internet rapidly as drone found on Google Maps. People's inability to kind of question those images when placed in this context is fairly unlimited. But of course, as soon as I'd made this one, I found this one. This appears to be an actual drone shadow. This is a screenshot from Google Maps of Creech Air Force Base and pilot them from. You can go onto Google Maps and you can find this exact image, a drone captured actually in flight, a truly rare thing. And I started looking through Google Maps to find images like this. This is Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. This is Beale Air Force Base in California in 2008. This is some more of the Predators lined up at General Atomics, manufacturer of the Predators, Gray Butte Field testing site in California. It's strange to me we don't see more of these. You can see a bunch more of them next door. Because we've built these extraordinary technologies for seeing the world. I find it constantly extraordinary that I can take up my cell phone at any moment and see through satellites. We've captured a picture of the whole Earth, that kind of long-held hippie dream. And we use it for really banal things like, finding our way to the store. There's a disconnect between the capabilities of our technologies and kind of what we choose to use them for. Here is the Predators at war in Kandahar. This is sometime in 2012. Joint Base Balad in Iraq in 2004. Or this one, most significantly. This is Shamsi Air Base in Pakistan. This image caused a bit of a stir when it was revealed in, I think, 2007, 2008. The image was actually captured in 2004. Years before the US government admitted that drones were operating in Pakistan, up to the point at which image was released and kind of incontrovertible proof was offered, it was flatly denied that drones were operating in this area. That information came out in a number of ways, but the information was suddenly available to kind of wide civilian use. One of the many kind of strange interventions that these digital mapping technologies have performed. So I've been seeing a lot of these images and kind of looking at them for ages, and I've been sort of drawn to the drones for some time. And I've been really puzzling over this and trying to work out why. They are compelling. Like, as Joe put it rightly, that there's kind of fever dream of contemporary society. You start to kind of pick up on them all over the place. But we have so little sense of them. And I was concerned that my interest in them was a kind of very adolescent, kind of 14-year-old boy thing about planes and guns, and wanting to be quite careful that wasn't the real source of my interest, or at least only part of it. And in this kind of close encounters of the third kind type of way that I tend to work, obsessively modeling these things and sketching them and trying to feel them out with my hands. This is a simple little kind of plastic model you can buy and build yourself, just like kind of fighter planes of old. And a friend of mine and I were sitting around my dinner table one evening, kind of toying with this thing, talking about the drones, trying to understand our interest in them. And we realized that this really wasn't enough, this little flimsy piece of plastic. It was so distant from the thing we were actually trying to describe. It had none of its weight, and it certainly had none of its size. That was a really kind of key realization for us, that we simply had no sense of what it would be like to stand in front or underneath one of these, as I said about the Smithsonian drone. I have no sense of the thing from this. So we thought the first thing we'd do is we'd work out how big they were. That was enough. then. And so with a piece of chalk and a schematic downloaded from the internet, we sketched it out in a car park in London outside my studio, and were suddenly confronted with the sheer scale of this aircraft, something that we'd had no conception of beforehand, something that lent it this kind of physical weight, even just an outline, that we could approach it a little bit, we could stand on it or over it, and we had suddenly a very different relationship with it. I painted another one in Istanbul last year. This was the first time I was kind of asked to do it publicly. It was an interesting time to be doing it. Turkey was and I think still is in negotiation to purchase Predators for their own use, to use against PKK rebels in the south of the country. This is not a local issue. These things kind of extend everywhere. And then at the beginning of the week, we painted the one you might have seen outside, with help from a lot of people here, across the pavement and the sculpture pad of the Corcoran, a certain kind of resonant location, as I think we're all more than aware. Sketching them out in this way kind of brings something to me of them every time. It's always necessary for me to do the work in order to understand what the hell it is that I'm doing. And new resonances kind of occur with everyone. There's the simple size of the thing. There's this sense of a shadow for me. It also relates to kind of protests I've been involved in the past. On the Iraq War protests of kind of 2000 and 2001 in London, I used to ask people to lie down in the street as there was a large body of people moving through, sketch around them quickly in chalk so that when the crowd moved off, this kind of lasting image of numbers was left there on the street. It's possible to mark the world in this way. It's unfortunate that not everyone will get this kind of top-down view of the thing where it really stands out. As you may have noticed, it has a very different impression on you from ground level, which is another little hint at what it is that the drones do. These are some of the first images that really that captured my interest in the drones and kind of started to transform it into a political interest. This is a photograph from an anti-drone protest in Pakistan from a few years ago. It's also something else that I find deeply intriguing, something that we don't see very often these days. This is a photograph of technology being burned in effigy. There's an impulse here that I don't believe is entirely about the drones. It's about much wider things than that. Burning something in effigy has all kinds of resonances. When it comes to technology, for me, I think of the Luddites. And the term Luddite and Luddism is one that's much abused and misused these days. It usually just kind of shorthand for signifying a kind of blanket rejection of technology, something quite kind of, it's used disrespectfully, essentially, to imply that people are, largely kind of stupid or afraid of the future or even of the present if they're Luddites. But the Luddites weren't an anti-technology movement, they were a social movement. They burned and trashed mill buildings because mills were disrupting society. They were destroying the compact between labor and landlord and the kind of labor and social structures of the time. Protests against technology are very rarely about the technology themselves. They're about the social conditions that technology kind of promotes or denies. I don't have so much more to say about this image or the one that follows. It's from Sana'a in Yemen, a protest only a couple of months ago in April. Except to say that in much of the world, the drone has become synonymous with certain types of foreign policy, and certainly with America's. The UK operates drones as well, and I feel very self-conscious coming to America to talk about these issues in many ways. I think the UK is as much a client state and a partner in these things as anything else. But in much of the world, the drone represents a certain view of particular foreign policies. The modeling is a constant theme of this stuff. This is another protest in Pakistan, and again you see this process of the drone being allied to other forms of protest. In this case, the campaign to free Afia Siddiqui, the Grey Lady of Bagram, who's a US-educated Pakistani scientist who's been imprisoned there for some time for terrorist-related offenses, which, of course, we never quite know what specific evidence might be involved there. Likewise, these have been employed in the US. This is a protest at a Air Force base in Syracuse, California, again, using the drone model as a way of concretizing, as making real the thing that we are discussing here. And I wanted to build upon that kind of model-making tradition in another thing you can see next door, which is a kind of identification kit for the drones that comes out of what for me was a very specific experience. When I was 14 or 15, I was forced to be a cadet, which was not a natural position for me, and spent a week of my summer holidays on an army base in the north of England, where I saw one particular extraordinary thing, which was in a field. I saw a group of Gurkha soldiers, who are British Nepalese soldiers, doing an exercise in a field which involved about 20 of them lying down on the ground with binoculars like this. And about 30 yards away, their officer was taking from a large chest tiny lead models of tanks and placing them one after the other on a kind of little hummock on the ground, which the soldiers would scrutinize. It was a tank identification training course to learn to recognize the difference between kind of friend and foe on the battlefield. And that kind of model making has a rich military and civilian history that I kind of learn more and more about and kind of fascinates me. It allows us to put these things kind of in context, both physically and historically. These are Pearl Harbor students constructing recognition models during the Second World War in shop class for use by army gunners. This is those models in use at the Las Vegas gunnery school during the war as well. Important militarily to be able to kind of sketch these things out and see them visibly. A slightly more contemporary reference. You might remember this from last year when an RQ-170 drone, the Sentinel, came down in Iran, and the circumstances around its downing remain somewhat unclear. We remain unsure of how exactly Iran obtained this drone, though it appears fairly clear that they did. Of course, the US asked for the drone back, and Iran said no. But shopkeepers in Tehran responded by creating more models of the drones and urging their customers to return those instead. But for me, actually, the more resonant sort of image of the observer, of the identification kit is scenes like this. This is Royal Observer Corps members in the 1950s. The Royal Observer Corps is a civilian organization in the UK. It was formed in the 1920s to respond to the threat of air raids. And there's similar organizations all around the world, organizations of civilians who come together to voluntarily watch the skies. Those observer corps have gone through kind of various different forms over the years. They started out as kind of watching for air raids or watching for the fires that might result from them. They evolved throughout the Cold War for various different functions. Some of them have disbanded. Others have become kind of environmental watch groups, looking out for pollution or other effects on the civilian environment. For me, that stands as a kind of a metaphor and maybe a watchword for all of us now, that we maybe need stronger contemporary observer corps, people who are looking out and paying attention and able to kind of communicate back to the rest of us what they've seen. Then I started looking at these. I became interested in one aspect of what the drones were doing, which is their covert use by the CIA in undeclared theaters of war in Pakistan, in the Yemen, in Somalia, potentially elsewhere. Because I was bothered that this whole program kind of remained in a kind of undisclosed, unknown zone. And I started looking at some of the journalistic sources who are investigating this stuff. This the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, whose work I use frequently. It's an extraordinary organization of freelance journalists based in the UK. The Long War Journal does similar work in the US. So these strikes are unreported officially, but there are eyewitnesses on the ground, and there's occasionally local media reports and so on and so forth. So journalistic organizations like this kind of collate this information, and you can go and read a little bit about what they've kind of discovered about particular events that have occurred. Details are shaky and unclear, but they are available. But looking at this and reading these more and more, I felt this kind of strange gap. This is a war that is going on. I mean, it's an undeclared one. It goes on outside the usual kind of rules and logics of war. But a war is occurring. And it's strange to me that we again, see so little of this occurring. We're used to living in a kind of media-saturated landscape for well over 100 years, 150. And further back, we've seen images of battlefields. Pre-kind of television and radio, newspapers would send sketch artists, illustrators to battlefields to draw them. We'd see imagery of these places. But the places that these were occurring, I had no visual sense of, and it made it hard to understand what might the effects of these things be. And yet at the same time, hyper-aware that we've built technologies, like I said before, to do precisely that, to make these places visible. I can go and explore any of these places virtually, should I want to or have the desire. And indeed, some people use these tools very specifically. This was a map, a set of directions posted to Twitter by a journalist in Yemen. This is driving directions to the site of a drone strike just south of Sana'a. And I realized that this was at least one way of trying to get a sense of what was occurring here, to get a little bit closer to these places. If there were no journalists on the ground and no soldiers on the ground, how else can we peer into these places? So I started a project called Dronestagram. Dronestagram follows the reports of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and every time they collate enough information to publish about a specific strike, I take all that information I can find about it, and I go through the various different online digital maps, satellite maps, to find as close as possible to those strikes as possible. And these are not exact. They're probably within a few kilometers, but the exact sites are for some time, and maybe will be for some time, kind of unknowable. But I'm attempting to make visible these landscapes, at least that we may be able to look through them, to kind of illuminate a little bit of that, the various ways in which these things are made visible or obscured, the ways in which, in fact, the network itself is kind of used to do that. There's a kind of embedded secondary critique in here as well that I sort of realized afterwards, that you're always enslaved to one system or another. Dronestagram got this kind of fantastic reaction and continues to get it. I don't like to continue to put these things online, but I'm still doing it. But the response is always fascinating. It's, as all these things, largely people shouting at one another, which has its own value as well. But also, the one response you kind of always get posting on a platform like Instagram is people going, "I don't want to like this," suddenly realizing the kind of the encoding of your potential reactions to things that have been designed into these systems that we use every day. I also saw it kind of, the reactions to it spill out very widely across the media. And it was interesting to see who's kind of interested in covering this stuff and why. The first kind of reaction, because it was a social media story, apparently, was kind of from tech blogs, and then it kind of started to spill over into the kind of wider media, into the news media, and into the art world to some extent. And this was, this is good and interesting, and also kind of terrifying. When you listen to, it's always scary when you hear journalists or the media talk about something that you know about, and you realize quite how many kind of misconceptions are embedded in that kind of stuff, and particularly when you hear them talk about technology. The different ways in which what I was doing were described, the the failure to grasp the kind of systems involved, the difference between applications and platforms, the difference between kind of websites and the internet, the difference between all these different layers of technology, the function of which are crucially important, was kind of completely lost in these descriptions of the thing. And that's something that should kind of worry us, I think, because we live in a world that's entirely saturated with technology, that is kind of run through with it at all levels, and yet we are unable to explain it even to one another. I'll come back to that again. But another of those images, I'll just read you the caption to this image as I found it on a US Air Force photo website. Edwards Air Force Base, California. After supporting the global war on terror for 3 years, Global Hawk Unmanned Aerial Vehicle number 3 received its official homecoming today when its wheels touched down at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time at Edwards Air Force Base. This is a photo of a robot receiving a homecoming parade, which again is one of these things that I find myself almost incapable of kind of processing fully. I'm not going to go down this route too much this evening because it's such a massive subject, but what this essentially should speak to us of is the kind of coming of automation in all areas of life. Robotic kind of warfare is always going to be just kind of the peak of the kind of trickle-down effect. This is always particularly true of military technologies. If you look back to the history of them, we have almost all of the technologies around us because of some kind of military involvement at some point. We have digital computers because of the necessity of calculating gunnery ranges and of specifically of developing the nuclear bomb. We have the internet and network technologies because of the decentralization of those computer systems in response to the threat of nuclear war during the Cold War. And we have so many contemporary domestic technologies, particularly things involving computer vision, like sort of the Xbox Kinect, which people have in their living rooms, again, because of military research projects. Automation is one of the kind of next step, and what that's going to do to the domestic economies around the world is we're kind of only yet starting to figure out. This is a proposed image for a new medal that was proposed last year. It's called the Distinguished Warfare Medal. It was proposed in, I think, October or November of last year as a medal to be awarded to drone pilots for distinguished acts in combat. And there was almost immediately a kind of huge backlash against this from population, from the media, particularly from veterans groups. And that concern largely sprang from the fact that in the kind of ranking of medals, the Distinguished Warfare Medal would be ranked higher than the Purple Heart, which is a medal that's awarded to people who have been physically wounded on the battlefield. That is a kind of marker of physical presence in warfare. Whereas this would go to people allegedly who sat hundreds of thousands of miles away in an air-conditioned trailer in the desert, while a robot kind of flew overhead far, far away, who were at no physical risk to themselves. And quite quickly the medal was withdrawn and it's sort of back under consideration again. But that discussion of the physical presence and the importance of it, I think, is key. If you look at the kind of emerging medical studies that are starting to appear, and we're only at the very early days of working this out, there's increasing signs that drone pilots suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and related medical issues at the same rate, if not in some cases higher rates than combat pilots. And there appear to be strong reasons for that. Drone pilots sit, yes, watching a screen all day, but they are intimately involved with the lives of the people that they surveil. They spend far longer over the target than a combat pilot would. They know more about the people who they may eventually end up firing a missile at than most soldiers have ever done in warfare before, and that has psychological effects. It also, I think, mirrors our wider societal aspects to the virtualization of these technologies. It's this endlessly repeated claim that we hear all the time that which happens in the virtual realm, those experiences digitally or experiences mediated by technology, are somehow of less emotional or psychological value than one-to-one, allegedly personal interactions that we have with people. Friends on Facebook aren't your real friends. Emailing someone is not the same as having a conversation with them. I don't believe that's true, and I think many of us would deny it just from our own experiences. We know that experiences mediated by technology can be just as emotionally valid, just as significant to our lives as other ones. But we're still struggling to conceptualize and express that. We still lack the mental models and ways of describing it. Because we live in this world where technology is completely obscure and completely effective. It surrounds us in all the ways, and yet we don't see it. This is a photograph of a data center in London. It's actually the third largest single node of the internet. Most of the UK's internet traffic passes through this building, and yet it's sort of strangely, it's the least anonymous data center I know. That's why I like it. It has this kind of weird pixel thing going on. But it is, at the same time, this kind of blank surface. The internet is not something we feel like we can see and touch at any time. We have no way to approach it. And this superstructure kind of repeats down at every level, down to the little black boxes that we carry around in our pockets that we must not open and we must not really understand. And that's fine up to a point where technology makes our lives easier. A lot of design we don't need to think about all the time, and we shouldn't have to. But it also has its kind of dangers as well. It makes this world kind of unparsable and illegible to us, and therefore we are incapable of kind of fully acting within it. It leads to a kind of a children's book version of reality, as the critical engineer Julian Oliver calls it, which is where, if you ask a good subset of people how the postal service works, for example, you'll get a fairly coherent answer. They'll say, well, you write a thing, and you write the address on the front, and you put it in a box, and another person comes and takes it and delivers it to someone else, and that's all good. And then you ask them how email works, and the whole thing just kind of collapses. People have no sense of how most of the world actually operates on a day-to-day basis. That's this children's book version of reality, this fact that we're all happy to live in a world of kind of comfortable illusions most of the time. And that's fine, except that there's people that don't. That it's possible to view these things, and it's possible to do things with them. That technology is visible and legible and actionable to those who have the privilege to see it. This is an image I made that, again, you can see next door, that I made in Photoshop in response to an artist's film, a film by Omar Fast called 5,000 Feet is the Best. It's a film about drones, and particularly about drone pilots, and it's fascinating. I urge you to see it if you can. There's this particular strange moment in it when, in reenactment, a drone pilot describes the moment of targeting an insurgent who has just planted an IED in the ground somewhere in a kind of theater of war. And I'll read you the quote from the film. And he says, "We call it in, and we're given all the clearances that are necessary, all the approvals and everything else. And then we do something called the light of God. The Marines like to call it the light of God. It's a laser targeting marker. We just send out a beam of laser, and when the troops put on their night vision goggles, they'll just see this light that looks like it's coming from heaven, right on the spot, coming out of nowhere from the sky. It's quite beautiful. This is a light that is only visible to those who have some kind of technological augmentation. It is a different way of seeing the world because you have the money and the power in order to kind of access it. It's a different sight, a different form of sight, an augmented human sight, restricted to certain kinds of power and privilege. This is a similar example, a very strange one, and quite personal to me. This is a new building in London. It's called the Shard. It's horrible. For a whole number of reasons, but it also, to me, strangely fascinating. It's currently the tallest building in Europe, and I can't describe the kind of visual and architectural impact it's had on London. But this is allegedly an image from its opening. They made a big fuss when it was opened, middle of last year, and they promised there was going to be a spectacular light and music show, and we should all watch it on their Facebook page. Despite that request, a couple of thousand people, myself included, actually turned up down on the riverbank and on the bridges over the Thames to watch this vast spectacle. And it didn't look anything like this. In fact, it looked like almost nothing. We could see the building. We couldn't hear anything. We could see a couple of what looked like kind of little green torch beams kind of coming out of it and waggling about for a bit, and that was it. And everyone was very disappointed and went home and blah. And then the next day, all of the newspapers were full of images like this. Because the photographers who'd come down had, expensive cameras with long exposure lenses with good lenses and taking long exposures that radically changed the vision that they could see. This is pure technology speaking directly to technology, pure power speaking directly to power. It's the ability to move something from one dimension into another, to shift a certain perspective. In this case, shifting the kind of visible spectrum out of the realm of human vision and into the realm of a technological vision. And you see this process quite specifically happening over and over again around drones. This is an interesting ongoing battle I'm involved with the Metropolitan Police, who are the police service for London. Around the time of the Olympics last summer, the police, they talked a lot of stuff. There was a lot of kind of security stuff around this, and one of the statements they kept making was that they were in possession of drones. Very non-specific about this, but they were using drones, and they were going to make us all secure through the use of drones, and they were using drones around the Olympics, and they said it before, and they said it afterwards, and then they stopped talking about it. And I was interested in that, because there's a whole bunch of issues around simple ones around drone use. I mean, there's ongoing questions about their effectiveness, for starters, in this kind of issue. It's a public police service, are they spending this money wisely? There's safety issues. There's actually quite strict laws around where you're allowed to fly these things and so on and so forth. And I hadn't seen these questions kind of asked or addressed anywhere. So I filed a Freedom of Information request, which, and there's equivalents here as well, where you are allowed to ask questions of public bodies. And so I asked them some questions about the drones that they said they used. I asked, did they actually do them? And if so, what was the kind of control parameters and lines of control around employing drones? What models of UAV they actually possess? Are these little kind of quadricopter things where they're flying Global Hawks at 50,000 feet, like what's going on here? Did they have permission to do so? Which is, something they need to be granted by the Civil Aviation Authority. And if they did or they didn't, do they still, and were they going to apply again, and so on and so forth? I happen to know they don't have permission because the CAA, unlike the Met Police, answers FOI requests and has never granted a permission to the Metropolitan Police to fly drones. However, that's not what the Metropolitan Police will say. The Metropolitan Police say, we will not confirm or deny anything about UAVs at all. Blanket, absolute response to all the questions. And I've asked this question in a number of different ways, and I'm still asking it in increasingly contorted ways, because they keep saying if you phrase the question differently, we might answer, so I'm going to keep on phrasing the question differently. But their standard response is, the Metropolitan Police will not comment in any way about the use of UAVs. And they say this very specifically because citing the exemption that they are legally granted to not discuss operational matters. They say, we can't tell you anything about this because it may aid criminals in some way. There's a stalling process in action here, and there's also, I think, a kind of fundamental distinction between operational use and the fact of possession and how they spend their money and so on and so forth. I understand they won't tell me about their operational use. I think they should tell me whether they possess them or not, because it's public money that they're spending on this stuff. I also think there's precedent for this. There's other successful FOI requests under which they've released the license plate numbers of every single car that they possess. They've released the model numbers and fuselage numbers and specs of every helicopter they possess. So why do UAVs represent a special class? I don't believe they do. But as we see repeated over and over again, drones are used not just for kind of big, scary flying things. They're used deliberately to change and modify the argument, to translate from one dimension to another, to make things impossible to talk about, to circumvent kind of existing laws and intensify secrecy around these kind of issues. And this is me being annoying. They actually, the last response used the brilliant phrase, what interests the public is not necessarily in the public interest, which I thought was rather snarky. But I'm going to keep doing it, but because pieces of this, paper like this, are really important. What they are allowed to say is important, because documents like this, that intensify secrecy, lead directly to documents like this, which is one of the more terrifying documents I've ever seen in my life. This is the letter from Theresa May, who is currently British Home Secretary, which stripped Mohammed Sakr of his British citizenship. Mohammed Sakr was a man who was born and grew up in London, my hometown. He had dual British and Egyptian citizenship, although there's no evidence he ever possessed an Egyptian passport or would have been granted access to Egypt under any circumstances. Nevertheless, using a rather ancient and outdated law, our Home Secretary saw fit to strip a citizen of their citizenship while they were out of the country, effective in 2010. 2 years later, Mohammed Sakr was killed by a drone strike in Somalia. Theresa May used a document like this to translate Mohammed Sakr from one dimension to another, to change his legal status that allowed different things to be done to him. We can translate many things from dimension to dimension, technologies, understanding, and people as well. Since 2010, my Home Secretary has stripped 16 people of their citizenship. I think we know who 8 of them are, and we're still unsure what might have happened to them. Then this is announced at the end of 2012. This term emerges in a series of reports in the Washington Post. Previously, in discussions of the drone war, there'd been a whole bunch of questions about who gets droned, right? Who gets killed. And the media started using this term, the kill list, which the administration wasn't terribly fond of. And they would never say it, and they, in fact, flatly denied the existence of any such list at all, which begs further questions. But in October of last year, it revealed that they did have a term for this, and that term was Disposition Matrix. This is the term that was given to the media as the term used internally for the intelligence gathering, analysis, collation processes that went towards deciding on the CIA assassination program. A term in itself which I find somewhat chilling and totally unclear as to what actually is going on here. What is the disposition matrix? Is it a set of processes? Is it a database? Is it just a list of names? Is it a massive filing cabinet? What are the processes kind of involved here? And there's the term disposition itself that is one of those slightly slippery terms with a number of sets of meaning. The term, the disposition of forces, a kind of standard military term for the arrangement or relationship between powers, with the echo of disposing of something. And the term matrix as well. A matrix is a specific mathematical term for a transformation, for moving something between dimensions. Disposition is also an intent, or a kind of latent action. This is the way in which it's used by the architectural theory of Keller Easterling, who talks about the disposition inherent in architecture, a fascinating kind of way of looking at the world and its architecture, and the way the two relate to one another, the way in which buildings sited in particular spaces transform not just the physical space, but the legal and political spaces around them. She often uses the example of kind of free trade zones, of kind of duty-free zones, or embassies, in which the physical laws of the space are changed or warped by the kind of imposition of architecture. By building this building here, we declare this ground to be of a different state than the surrounding area. By building this cell tower here, we transform this space in the electromagnetic spectrum. In this way, for me, the drones kind of transform these spaces as well. They transform the space through which they travel physically, granting this kind of overhead view and this possibility of action. They also transform legal and diplomatic space, as we've seen. They change the way in which we feel we can apply laws. They change our definitions of people and states. They break down the kind of barriers that we've erected kind of legally around issues of human rights, the rule of law, and the proper conduct of war. Rendering these kind of obsolete previous concepts like the kind of battlefield or the theatre of conflict. Theatre, I think, being quite significant here as well, because for me, much of this is performance. The disposition matrix is itself a performance, both in its terminology and in the way it's presented to the public. There is a dance occurring here as we are told what we're allowed to know and held back from what we're not. For a while now, I've been building a strange little piece of software that appears partly in this exhibition, just on the surface, and is also entitled, the name of this lecture and the show, A Quiet Disposition, in response to the Disposition Matrix. A quiet disposition is a system that scans the internet constantly for references to drones and the drone program and the disposition matrix itself, gathering in the names of people and the relevant terms connected to it, and attempts to, in some way, make some sense of it. It's a kind of naive artificial intelligence, a very stupid one. It's exploring, it's trying to read everything it can about this world in order to understand it. It finds all of these terms as it goes along, and when it finds a term that has some kind of relevance, it finds a couple of people connected to those terms and tries to establish some kind of link between them. It's really stupid, but it exhibits many of the qualities of kind of fully automated systems, of automated intelligence gathering, in many of the kind of similar mistakes that it makes, in the kind of strange glitches one finds within it, and also in the strange and slightly resonant pairings it does occasionally make. All of this has been automated. This is entirely software-based, these things that it's been finding, the people that it reveals. It found me quite quickly, by the way, and I'm, of course, now in the database myself. In the exhibition, you'll find this particular work, this particular piece of software presented in two ways as one thing. In part, it's presented as these books. The books are snapshots of the archive, essentially. There's 10 of them. They were produced in a 10-day series a couple of months ago. They're snapshots of the database in progress. They contain bits of the information, little segments of it. They don't tell the full story, because it's kind of impossible to tell the full story in this way. I come from a background in publishing. I like printing things out. I'd just print the whole internet if I could. It's the only way I think I could try and understand it. But it's not possible. Knowledge and understanding is not codifiable in the way that we used to do it anymore. These books point towards, for me, a kind of new form of network knowledge, where the meaning resides kind of explicitly in the network. It resides in the connections between things and not in their kind of individual instantiations. It's not reducible to these kind of singular objects or to temporarily limited domains. So alongside it, next door, there's the visualization you just saw, which is live and connected to the program as it carries on its work elsewhere. You can only see it kind of glimpsed from one direction. It's an ongoing process. It's reading the internet and these news stories right now. A reminder that this process is kind of ongoing and indefinite and quite definitely happening elsewhere in ways that we can't fully understand or truly comprehend, that will always remain to us a kind of black box. For me, the drones are prostheses. They're kind of avatars of the network itself. I should have said this earlier. Every time I say network, what I'm talking about is not just the internet, but the internet and us. There's no longer for me a meaningful distinction between the kind of other world of technology and the world in which we inhabit. For so long we've kind of kept the internet in this box, all network technologies, as something remote, as a cyberspace, as somewhere kind of that's elsewhere, but it's not. We all know that it's layered across everything now, that the network technologies kind of saturate the world around us. And so the drones, for me, these kind of charismatic megafauna of the networked world, they perform the same effect as the network itself. They allow this kind of extraordinary sight and action at a distance. They grant the ability to communicate and to take action. But while the civilian network, the social media and mapping and all those technologies that we use every day are kind of tuned towards openness and transparency, the drones use almost exactly the same technologies to obscure and divide. And while I'm, largely an optimist and a positivist about these things, and basically a vocal advocate for the new, and trying to note it and describe it in all terms, I don't really believe that technology actually engenders many truly novel behaviors or actions. Rather, technology tends to kind of enable and permit latent human actions and reveals them to us in ways that we haven't been fully conscious of before. It's not about the drones at all. It's about technology. It's about all of these little black boxes that we don't fully understand but have an incredibly important impact on our world. The drones stand in for all of our invisible, intangible, numinal technologies. But kind of in their jet stream, we might kind of glimpse something about them. For me, the true state of the world kind of emerges when we gaze really deeply at these technologies. The world is formed as much by our understanding of technologies as by the technologies of themselves. It's vital, with the amount of work that these things do in the world, that we work hard to understand them. But while much of that kind of sounds quite grim, and I'm constantly going on about this kind of new languages that we need and new frameworks that we need to understand, I also believe that technology is incredibly positive in doing that. Technology is always the kind of reification of political intent. And obscurity is a classic tool of power. It's the way it operates. It withdraws and restricts knowledge. But the nature of technology itself means this stuff has to be written down. It has to be encoded into things. And as we slowly learn to understand the operation of those things, we can actually come to have a better understanding of them ourselves, open up these things, make them visible, and therefore make them more and not less amenable to debate and to disruption and to critique. Thank you very much. I believe there was time for questions if anybody has them. Although there is also, I believe, drinks, so make your minds up. Does anyone have any questions?